Hello and welcome to the channel. This is a new channel I've recently started, and the title of the channel is called Great Britons, and I do hope you're going to enjoy it. I think particularly for history fans and also for people just generally in things that have happened in the not only the near but the distant past. I thought we'd kick off by discussing the things that had happened way back in the year 1700. I think kind of the year 1700 onwards, it began to reach the notice, if you like, of parliamentarians and the general public too. The issue is around the ability to know where you are once you've gone to sea. And in those days, the big issue that sailors had was that it was impossible almost to know what your longitude was. Now, your latitude was actually, even in those days, relatively simple. With the aid of a simple sextant piece of equipment and measuring that against the horizon, it was actually quite simple to tell exactly where you were, latitude-wise. Longitude was a totally different issue, and for hundreds of years had baffled everyone. And quite frankly, nobody understood or was able to come up with a mechanism for calculating your exact longitude when on board ship. Now, like I said, no one was able to come up with a solution so far, at least, as to how you could possibly calculate where you were once you'd gone to sea. There were all sorts of dreadful accidents at sea, sailors dying from lack of water, scurvy, and a great deal of ships sinking as they crashed into rocks that they were not expecting to see. Again, all down to the fact that they didn't know exactly where they were. One of the worst examples was about half a dozen ships, I think it was, returning from being at sea for some time. And they were very close to the UK coastline. And they all tragically died at sea. All the ships went down with all hands on board. Absolute tragedy. Really was something terrible. And this was around the Scilly Isles, by the way. The incident shocked the establishment so much that it was decided at that time that this really shouldn't be tolerated. If there was any chance at all of finding a solution, then all effort should be put into finding some kind of solution. At the time, Queen Anne was on the throne, and an Act of Parliament came into being with enormous prize money, it has to be said at the time, for what was called a practical solution to the issue of finding longitude at sea, to establish exactly where you were. And this obviously the Act of Parliament came into being, and scientists and scholars from all around the world indeed became extremely interested in trying to help, and all sorts of strange schemes were put forward and evaluated. There was a board of longitude established, and their job was to evaluate some of these ideas, many of which were incredibly strange. And it's fair to say that most of the ideas, if not all of the ideas, were not really practical, and that was the key wording in the Act of Parliament, that it had to be a practical solution. For example, many scholars said, well, if we just observe the stars at night, then that's fine, we can work out where we are. All well and good, but what they call celestial observation back in the day didn't work very well if it was cloudy, for example. So for most of the month, in any given month, most of the month, whether it be weather conditions or whatever, you couldn't actually observe the stars anyway. So, like I said, on the surface, might have sounded a good idea, but in practice, really was never going to work. At this part in our story, our hero enters the story, John Harrison. Now, John Harrison was from the north of England. He was a very gifted carpenter and maker of beautiful sort of grandfather type clocks. He heard of the new Act of Parliament being proclaimed and became very interested in the whole subject and thought that he may be in a position to hopefully solve the problem. I think it's fair to say to all of those experts and others that took part in working on this issue, I don't think anybody really understood the enormity of what they were taking on. In John Harrison's case, it actually took literally for him and his son, it took virtually an entire lifetime of absolute dedication. And to me, this is what singles out some of the people in this series that we're calling Great Britons, because this is my number one hero. He really is. The absolute dedication is quite breathtaking. So, as I said, I hope the story grabs you as much as it does me. It really is something to behold, the sheer work and dedication put into this thing. A bit later on in the story, we'll talk about the Act of Parliament and the prize money and all the rest of it. But when you look at the amount of work involved and the fact that there were, as I said, John Harrison and his son, as he got older, one or two people around him, specialist watchmakers in London, etc. When you look at the number of people that were involved and you divide that across how long it took to actually get the results, there's no way that you would have done it for the money, because it simply wasn't enough. As much as it was deemed to be a fortune in those days. But this thing took over 50 years. So there you go. Absolute wonderful guy, really is. And never got the recognition that he deserved from the establishment, let's say. Okay, so this is the easy bit. Well, we certainly hope it is. So John Harrison started off by saying, right, what do we know so far before we kick off this? And I put up this slide just to explain for us all his kind of starting point, which was simply that when, the known things at that time, the Earth comprises a circle, therefore it must be 360 degrees. We know that from any given point, for example, midday in London today till midday in London tomorrow, takes 24 hours to get back to the same point in the sky. So if we take the 360 degrees and we divide that back by 24 hours, would you believe we get an answer of 15? Wonderful. So we know that the Earth is rotating at 15 degrees per hour. Wonderful stuff. Well, if the last slide was the easy bit, this particular one absolutely blows my mind. It really does. You can only describe it as sheer brilliance. John Harrison came up with an idea that had never been thought of by anyone else, and he just sort of imagined that there was an imaginary line that runs all the way around the Earth. Okay, and it just so happens that the line actually runs vertically down through London, Greenwich, and carries on all around the world. And that imaginary line is actually defined as 0 degrees longitude. So if that line is 0, then moving away from it either to the right or the left, east or west, is there are a whole series of other lines which are also imaginary. This really is incredible stuff. It really is. For example, a line that is 15 degrees east of London Greenwich would be plus 15 degrees longitude, and likewise a line that is 15 degrees west of London Greenwich, that would be described as minus 15 degrees longitude. As I've said, where on earth this came from is just incredible, absolutely wonderful. Okay, the next step. And all through his career, John Harrison was very well aware of the Act of Parliament, which stated categorically that whatever solution anyone came up with, it was absolutely critical that it must be a practical solution. And John came up with a range of ideas which we're showing now on the slide. It actually shows how relatively quickly it would be in order to calculate your exact position when at sea or some far-flung port around the world. One of those things looked great in theory. The thing that really stopped the thing moving forward is the comment there on the top left-hand side, where it says categorically that there are no watches or clocks anywhere in the world that had the accuracy to be able to measure to the degree of accuracy that was needed whilst at sea. So he knew what he'd got to do, he knew what needed doing, but was a long, long way from getting there. It had to be that needed to be an incredibly robust timepiece in order that you could take it to sea and it would still work. Okay, so now it's time for John Harrison to really set to work. And he knew that to kick things off, he needed to get himself down to London, seek the assistance of watch and clock makers who were more used to working with other materials, various kinds of metals, etc. So off he went and set off down south. Upon his arrival, he immediately set to work on what is affectionately now known as H1, an absolutely beautiful timepiece. However, it has to be said, it is pretty huge, beautiful clock encased in a wooden and glass frame, and extremely difficult to maneuver around, particularly on and off ships of those days. Obviously, that took a couple of years to perfect. And during that time, he approached the Board of Longitude, as the Acts of Queen Anne required that the whatever invention was put forward, it needed to be tested on a sea voyage. Unfortunately, there were no long-distance voyages planned just at that time. So John agreed that the clock be tested on a trip to Portugal, and this duly happened. It was a steep learning curve for John, being aboard ship. The ships of the 1700s were not exactly what you might describe as comfortable. And I think another sort of turn up for John was not quite realizing how often cannons get used whilst at sea. Back in those days, they were not simply used during wartime. In fact, it was a frequent signalling method from one ship to another to fire off cannons. That was a real surprise for John. The conditions, it has to be said, were pretty dreadful, and trying to keep written notes of what was going on and the regular checks on time and accuracy and all the rest of it proved to be incredibly challenging. And upon John's return to London, obviously all the information had to be presented back to the Board of Longitude, and they were pretty poor quality notes, really. And as you might expect, the Board of Longitude were unhappy with them and simply said that they were not up to standard. So unfortunately, that that particular trial was deemed to be, I don't know, some people would say a qualified success, but as I said, there wasn't really the documentary evidence to support what was being claimed. And so several years passed by. Meanwhile, John Harrison was working extremely hard on his next clock, which again had come to affectionately know as H2. The clock was smaller, and what John had tried to do was to implement, or rather to integrate, some improvements to it. In particular, not only things that you would need at sea, but also integrations like making the thing easier to assemble or take apart and all that sort of thing. So worked very, very hard on it, John, and obviously it has to be said, those people around him whom he engaged to make various prototypes. So what followed was ultimately yet another request to the Board of Longitude for another sea trial, and that went ahead as planned. The journey seemed to be, in many ways, even worse than the first one, but again proved to be a massive learning curve for John Harrison. I think the thing on this particular journey was the excessive use of cannons, and what I think John had not realized the first time around is that when the cannons fire, this has the effect of kind of almost spinning the ship around. So you get this kind of centrifugal force, which he just simply hadn't considered that at all. And frankly, the clock could not cope with that. So that became a major issue for him. Upon his return to London, it really was admitted that H2 had not fulfilled the Acts of Parliament. And again, I think really it was a time in John's life when he really felt up against it. He felt it's a problem that was just entirely insurmountable. And he actually returned home to the north of England and really had to consider his future. Respect for him. And I think they were all very, very sorry to learn that, kind of given up in a way, that he just felt that the issue of centrifugal force in particular was just an absolutely insurmountable problem. He was very, very down. Meanwhile, the practice of guessing your position whilst at sea continued, and that practice became known as dead reckoning, because if you got it wrong, well, you can just imagine the consequences. Many, many thousands of sailors continued losing their lives at sea. And like I said, John's friends were all too aware of the dangers every time you left port and went out to sea. So a number of them called on John and did try and persuade him to start looking at the issue again. Like I said, this was a huge, huge undertaking. It really was. And so I think it really did pick up John's morale. And, he did then decide to return to London and pick up where he'd left off. And indeed began work on a new clock, which has become known as H3. And so that's really what John did. He worked on H3 for some time. I think during the course of his work, he actually had some kind of a real sort of brainwave, if you like. Instead of it being a traditional clock like the ones he'd made previously, he came up with this idea of making something that was not much bigger than a fob watch. It was actually a beautiful encased hand watch, about 5 inches diameter, about 125 millimeters. And he thought, well, if we could make something as small as that, surely that must be deemed a practical solution and meet the requirements. of the Act of Parliament. And so the Royal Society actually awarded a gold medal to John Harrison for his services to horology. I think they were rather hoping that they'd heard the last of John. He'd gone very quiet and nothing much was happening as far as they were concerned. And I think when John did eventually turn up with his clocks H3 and the sort of fob watch H4, requesting a sea trial, it came as a total shock to the Board of Longitude. And they tried their level best to put obstacles in the way. Let's say that. But I don't think they were too keen on the idea of a guy that had no further education at all. He'd simply been apprenticed to his father as a clockmaker. They weren't happy about a guy with that level of background education that he should come up with these wonderful products. Anyway, eventually they did agree to a sea trial, and the trial went ahead on the trip to Jamaica. The trial was an absolute fantastic thing, really. It really was. I mean, it was so easy and quick to use the equipment to tell exactly where you were. I think it quite astounded the other people on board. As John Harrison was reaching his later years now, bearing in mind he'd been working on this thing for almost 50 years, it was decided that it was John's son that would actually carry out the trial. And upon his return to London to present the Board of Longitude with the results, it has to be said they were completely shocked. The results were absolutely fantastic. And I just think, it came as a complete shock to the board. So much so that they'd asked for further proof, which was a weird thing because it was never written into the Act in the first place. They just decided, oh, hang on a minute, this could have been a fluke. Let's have a further trial. Oh, okay then. So a further trial was actually insisted upon. And so the next available ship out was to Barbados. And so this trial went ahead as well. A bit of a shock and a surprise to the Harrisons, but there we go. I mean, they thought, well, we've done it now. We've cracked it. We've got a wonderful product that does the job and meets the requirements. So they just agreed to it. And sure enough, great results from everyone that was on board with them, that were there to witness what was taking place and what was being recorded. And upon the return to London, again, the results were presented to the Board of Longitude. I think they were full of regret, but they did reluctantly present John Harrison with an acknowledgement, if you like, that, yeah, okay, you have come up with a practical solution that does meet the requirements of the Act as laid down by Queen Anne. However, and here's the interesting part, they still did not think it was their role yet to hand over the prize money. Instead, they said they wanted duplicate copies made, H4, and they wanted the whole thing taken apart and describing to various members of the team in terms of how it works, how each individual part is constructed, and all the rest of it. In fact, a whole raft of additional requirements that were never called for in the Act. They procrastinated for several years after the full acknowledgement was handed over. Queen Anne had passed away and been replaced by the King, who was a big fan of John Harrison. He was quite keen on gizmos and engineering and all that kind of stuff. And it asked John to take along H4 and describe the way it works. And although I couldn't find anything in the history books about this, I do think that maybe at some stage the king had intervened. I say this because some years later, Parliament suddenly had a change of heart. So the Act of Parliament was debated in the House of Commons. And would you believe it, eventually Parliament did agree that John Harrison should be paid immediately all the sums due to him. Now, the prize money plus various payments he'd been receiving to build prototypes over many, many years, the payments came to around about £25,000. Now, like we said, back in the year 1700. So I've sort of quickly worked that out. And that comes to about £4.5 million, which, yes, I know sounds an absolute. But John Harrison was actually 80 years old when he received the payout. He'd been working on the thing for, I don't know, at least 55 or more years. His son must have been working on it for, I don't know, let's just say for the sake of argument, at least 50 years, and a couple of assistants down in London building prototypes and all sorts. So, yeah, on the face of it, it does sound a fortune, 4.5 million, but when you kind of divide the thing back, all I'm saying is you wouldn't really have done it for the money. It's really been done for a labour of love, in my view. Now, I don't want to take anything away from the British Navy. Our wonderful men and women of the service do a fantastic job. But next time you hear the song Rule Britannia, Britannia Rules the Waves, I wonder, have you ever given any consideration to what John Harrison really did? You've got the rest of the world sailing up and down, without a clue of where they are, crashing into things all over the place. And the British Navy allowed to roam the world, discovering new countries and all the rest of it, with complete accuracy as to knowing where they were and how to get there. I don't know, it just occurs to me that the impact of what John Harrison did has never really fully been appreciated, and certainly not recognised, when these days all you've got to do is be a regular milkman to Member of Parliament, and you're probably going to end up with an MBE. So when you consider what John Harrison did and the fact he was never acknowledged for it, it just makes you wonder. If ever you're in the London area as a visitor or just enjoying a few days down there, I would encourage you just to jump on a boat for a short trip down the River Thames. Go and have a look at the Harrison Clocks collection down there. It really is well worth seeing. You can actually see the longitude line of 0 degrees longitude, and all the students having their photographs taken stood astride the 0 degree line. And like I said, it really is just a wonderful collection to see. So do get yourself down there if you possibly can. Very much hope you've enjoyed this somewhat lengthy presentation, but I think personally the guy is worthy of spending some time on. This is something that changed lives for the better and forever. So, what a wonderful achievement, and certainly number one in my choice of great Britons. Thank you very much for your time. Bye for now. Oops, I almost neglected to mention that if you did enjoy the content, then please do click the like or subscribe buttons. They are absolutely free, I do assure you, and make a big difference to the channel and will ultimately help us to grow. So, do tick those buttons if you enjoyed listening to the story, and I'll be doing lots more in the future. Thanks very much for your time, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.